welcome to Canonical. I'm James Shao, and I'm joined by Ia Darris and Sam Spieler.
Hello.
Hey.
Today, we are continuing our series on postmodern novels of the South with a discussion of Karen Russell's Swamplandia. As a reminder, you can join our extended book club discussion on Reddit at Canonical Pod, and you can find us on social media at Canonical Pod, one word. If you would like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which you can find in our episode description. We will be talking spoilers here, so if you don't want the ending spoiled for you, check out our review, which was published last week. This is the second book in our series. Next week, we will review our last book in the series, The Moviegoer by Walker Percy. So let's get started on Swamplandia.
Before we get started, I do want to point out that we will be discussing the child rape that happens in this book. We've talked about classification on this podcast before and how it largely only serves the publisher, but I think it can also show a separation between the different types of readers who are willing to engage with a book. We've read a number of quote-unquote serious books, some of which did not have clear resolution. And while I like resolution, I also enjoy messiness and things that aren't so tidy. Swamplandia explores important serious themes, and yet its ending to me signals that this is not as serious or heavy as a book as it could have been. In our last episode, I suggested that I would recommend this as a young adult novel, not solely, but I think there's a lot of young adult elements here. I know I'm heading into territory of preference and of kind of, well, if I had written this book, this award-winning book, but there is a progression of events that at first bothered me and then excited me and then just satisfied me, but not in the way that I really wanted. I'm talking about how this started as a magical realist style book, which is largely why I picked it. And then it became crushingly real with the Birdman character. And at first I felt duped, like the characters, discovering magic doesn't exist. And even the title has this big exclamation mark in it. But then I came around to it for the same reason, that duping was a big part of it. Then there was a moment when Kiwi sees his sister, and we, or at least I, figured that it was Ava. And a part of me was relieved. But when it turns out to be his middle sister, Aussie, my writer's heart kind of thumped loudly because what a great way of toying with the reader. I thought, wow, what if he actually kills off Ava? What if she escapes the Birdman only to die of exposure or thirst or hunger? I thought that would be a great Grimm's fairy tale type of ending. But then she gets saved anyway. The only thing that doesn't get wrapped up all tidy is the Birdman, who I was kind of hoping would get eaten by a gator. So that was one thing that I was struggling with. If there is a lesson here about things not being what they seem, we get a lot of that, but it all ends fairly rosily anyway, minus the Birdman unscathed after raping a child. I'm sure this ending sits better with a wider group of readers, but it felt a little less serious to me.
So would you say that this is the stereotypical happy ending? Is that what's putting you off?
Yeah, happy ending minus the knowledge that Ava did spend some weeks not being able to sleep. She doesn't tell anyone about what happened, which I understand is common, but it just wraps up all neat and fairly happy. The family is back together again, and they're moving forward.
I was expecting somebody to die. I was expecting Ava to die, and I think it would have had a different impact if she did, but I don't think it's a problem that she didn't. I think that there are other stakes, and I think that while they do live, they lost their way of life, and something special to them, something that they cherished, seems to have been lost forever. And I think that still adds some poignancy to the end of the novel.
Right. And their mother is still gone, and that's part of the reckoning at the end, is that their mother has already been gone and the park is just limping along. So now they're letting it go with her. But even that, I feel like we get the loss of the mother hammered onto us quite a bit throughout the novel, especially at the end. Like when with Kiwi, the poster, I
Yeah.
thought that was a great moment, but it keeps happening.
I think the book sets up a certain expectation. It toys with the reader because Ava is much more the focus in my mind than Kiwi, and her attachment to her mother is less credulous than Kiwi. Like Ava, when she enters the underworld, seems to have this sincere belief that she might see her mother again. And as readers, at least me as a reader, I'm positioned to say, well, it's not going to happen the way that you think it's going to happen. Therefore, I'm already willing to accept it as a lost cause. I don't think it was ever really on the table. Did you ever think that she was actually going to find her mother?
I didn't know what kind of book this was at the beginning. So there were signs that there was disbelief in magical things. But, I mean, this is about a swamp and gators, and there's talk of ghosts. And the longer that Aussie talks about the Dredgeman and Lewis Thanksgiving, I started to believe it, that, okay, maybe this is real to them. I didn't think they would find her mother. For some reason, that never actually occurred to me as being something that would happen. But I thought maybe there is something supernatural here.
It sounds like you're talking about two different things here. One is the stripping away of the magic, and the other is the happy ending. So, Sam, do you see those two parts as the same? Do you see them both resulting in some kind of disappointment for you as a reader?
No. And in fact, the first one at first was a disappointment. But as I said, I came around to that because I thought that was a great shift that Russell takes us through. That I picked this book partly for magical realism. So I was slightly disappointed when it became more and more just realism. But I wasn't really disappointed because there's this great sinking feeling the further into the swamp she goes. And it's just foreshadowing whatever is about to happen and what ends up happening. And you can see it a mile away, but at least for me, I kept wanting to not believe it. And the fact that it did made it a stronger book for me, that all of the magic just got taken away from us. While I was sad that now we're left with a different book, I was really amazed at how well she did that. But the ending is a different animal completely. I didn't hate it, but I was a little disappointed that it just was this tidy bow of the whole family gets back together.
Basically, it seems like you're talking about the ending of the novel and how it would have been otherwise. But what if we back up to the middle of the novel and her and the Birdman in the forest? Like, what if the novel were otherwise, such that the Birdman were magic, but he still hurt her in the same way? Would the novel have satisfied you, or would it have been unpleasant?
All things said and done, I was not disappointed in the turn to more realistic sensibilities. I think the Birdman was one of the things that made it hold on to that magic for a long time, because he's so strange compared to anyone else that you've known. He wears this coat made of feathers. He's got a whistle that we think calls to birds, but we can't hear it.
Is there a moment when the magic is gone, or is it a fading kind of gradient?
I thought it was a fading. There are a couple moments when you'll realize either before Ava or another moment where you realize at the same time as Ava that this is not good. Like when she sees the hunters in the background and she decides in an instant to call for help. I think that's when she realizes her brain forces her to act before she even knows what she's doing. And I think for that's like the last moment of she's in for it. But in general, it's a slow decline.
I would count the rape scene as kind of confirmation of the absence of magic in the novel. But I'm not entirely sure if I even believe myself when I say that, because I think it does add something to the novel that there is magic, and it's deadly magic or it's harmful magic. And I think that it would have taken the novel in a very different direction, but I think I still would have enjoyed it. I think the fact that Louis Thanksgiving, Ossie's boyfriend, left her at the altar is harmful, but it doesn't disprove his existence. It just shows that this world that they live in is full of malicious spirits, and sometimes they'll hurt you. And I think that that's a much darker turn than the happy ending that you're talking about, but I think it could have worked.
What do you make of his character, Louis Thanksgiving? Because that's the one element that stuck out as, I don't know what to make of him. Ossie certainly seems convinced.
That's one of the best parts for me.
Yeah, the story of his death on the dredge is really the best part.
Yes. And also the duality of kind of like a Schrodinger's ghost, where you don't actually know if he's a ghost. Because you could read it both ways. You could read it that she's someone who is hallucinating, or because eventually she does get medication. But you can also read it as Ed said, there are actually ghosts in this world, and they can inhibit people's bodies. And then he just left her or abandoned her. Or he completed his journey and his spirit goes back home.
That was another tidying up at the end that I still don't know what to make of it. It's still turning over in my head, the medication.
I think it complicates it because, like I said in the previous episode, what I found refreshing about the novel is that it moves from enchantment to disenchantment, and it feels like a vindication for a materialist worldview. And not that I endorse a materialist worldview, but it complicates things, because I feel like this idea that we should all live with a sense of wonder and childlike amusement is kind of a trite sentiment. And I feel like anything that a writer could do to complicate that is good.
It's a further loss of innocence that we're seeing with Ossie.
Even to call it a loss of innocence, I think is kind of casting your ballot one way by saying, she was better off beforehand. I think that it makes you feel sorry for her only because in popular media, I think there is a trope of the wild genius who's mentally invaded by psychiatric medicine and kind of dumbed down, And I feel like the novel does make you feel sorry for her, but you might also say, well, she's finally becoming healthy. I think that it's ambiguous, and I think that ambiguity is really what makes the ending worthwhile.
Yeah, I agree. And I think you can find that ambiguity throughout the novel with a lot of different ideas. So one, like you were talking about, is like whether or not ghosts exist, or does she have mental health issues? Another one is this kind of dreaminess or idealism of this, alligator-themed park, as compared to the very functional job as a janitor for the world of darkness. So I see a lot of this throughout the book, and that's what makes it interesting to me, because I don't think you can say, after reading this book, I don't think you can say, well, Swamplandia is what they need to hold on to, because by the end of the book, Swamplandia is not some kind of cure-all, and the world of darkness actually is helping them survive. So even though it's being skewered in satire, you can see the necessity of it for the whole family.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, Swamplandia is this anchor that's pulling them down underwater.
Yeah, so it's that kind of muddiness, pun intended, I guess, that makes this book interesting. Like Yed was saying, I don't think you can read this book just one way and say, well, by the end, this book advocates for this lifestyle, or it advocates for this idea. I don't think you can say that by the end.
We were talking about this kind of magical realist aspect of the beginning of the novel, and even throughout, I would say, most of the novel, we're never really sure exactly how close the world is to our world. What I noticed is that Russell approaches the building of this world in an interesting way, and I kept thinking about the novel that we read previously on our podcast, Kafka on the Shore by Haruki Murakami. Russell's approach to creating a strange magical world is to replace things from our own known world with things that are similar but notably off. Like the world of darkness is similar to a Universal Studios, but clearly no actual corporation would call a theme park the world of darkness. And they go to Burger instead of Burger King. It's just everything in our world is amplified to an absurd degree. In Kafka on the Shore, the opposite sort of thing happens. I feel like a lot of things from our world are removed. Certain touchstones, like music, is a very common touchstone in Murakami, and certain sort of geographic features remain, but a lot of things feel missing, and it's a different type of dreamlike world or a different type of magical world. What's the effect of this difference? Why do they use these different tools? Do they have different ends?
For me, the most obvious effect is this is much more of a satire because you know what it's referencing, or at least you have a general idea of what it's referencing. With Murakami, I don't think you can call it a satire. I think because he's constantly removing, he creates almost a different world that's so different from our own that you're not really referencing anything in our world. So for me, that's the chief difference.
I agree with you, James, in that it works very clearly for satirical purposes. The only thing I would say is that it brings up, in my mind at least, the question of, is doing something for humor enough? Like, I feel like when she calls it the world of darkness, I think it's funny, and I like that. But is that a cheap shot? Does it need to have greater significance? Or is it okay to just amplify the world in an absurd way just because it's funny?
I don't think it's only funny, though. I know what you're saying. This isn't really the gist of your question, because to answer your question, I don't think just being funny is enough, but I don't think it's only funny. I think a good satirist isn't only funny. They actually are engaging with the ideas behind the material. Like the world of darkness, it is funny, but it also exists on another level in that they've exited their childhood. In a way, Kiwi has exited his childhood. So he's entering the adult world, which is much more painful than the world of his childhood, even though he kind of loathed the world of his childhood. So it's called the world of darkness, but it's not just funny. It also has other meanings attached to it that kind of rhyme with other things that are happening in the novel.
Well, I know it has other meanings, but the first thing I would say is, why is humor not enough? Why does it need to be more than funny?
I think that's, for me, is the difference between satire and comedy. I think a satire has to have something more than just funny. You're making a point with your comedy.
This is something I think we could probably talk more about in the series wrap-up or on Reddit, but I think this is a good contrast with the Confederacy of Dunces,
Yes.
because
Yeah.
in that novel, there is a lot of funny, and I'm wondering if that funny is just funny or if it has the more that Swamplandia seems to have.
So I actually looked at this slightly differently from you, James. I see Murakami as someone who likes to make the familiar strange, even though we're not super familiar with Japan. He's using real world locations and he's twisting them. Versus with Russell, she's telling the reader, you haven't been here, so don't worry about the specific locations. These are generalities versus the more localized Murakami. Murakami does use locations that aren't real, but they're buried in places that are very real. He might mention Shinjuku Station, but also I feel like Murakami is more the true magical realist, the supernatural stacked right on top of the natural world. Whereas Russell, at least in this book, removed that magic over time to reveal the real world underneath. I think that removal does a lot of work in this book. that it's one of the main points of this book.
So do you say then that Murakami is kind of magical to us to a greater extent because we're not Japanese?
No, I mean, he's using more magical things that remain magical. In that book, we had talking cats, we had other dimensions, other worlds, we had things that could have happened, I suppose, like fish falling from the sky. But the main thrust of the magic in his books are actual magical things that don't really happen in our plane of existence.
I feel like there are different kinds of magic, whether or not we get to know at the end of Swamplandia that it's not real magic. There's an intensity, a vibrancy to the world that we find in Swamplandia that is absent, completely absent from Kafka on the Shore. Kafka on the Shore is like a very gauzy, hazy sort of world. And Swamplandia, especially with that exclamation point in the title, everything is turned up to 11. Everything is intense.
A part of that is also their style, and I know this isn't exactly your focus yet, but Russell's style is very rich, and she is a fantastic writer, very evocative, whereas I don't think you'd say the same about Murakami. He's quite spare. And he does evoke a certain kind of image, but it's a different image. It's not rich. It's more minimalist. It's much more, it reminds the reader more, I think, of like someone trying to meditate, whereas Swamplandia is not at all like that.
Do you think a part of that comes from the narration styles? Like most of the Murakami I've read, the narrator is usually this very flat, somewhat uninteresting male character, whereas here we have a very vibrant teenager. Ava is very different from Kafka.
Yeah, I think that's a part of it. I mean, they are both teenagers, so that's something. But I think, for example, one thing I noticed is Russell uses a lot of similes in her writing, and the images that she uses in her similes are fantastic. Murakami also uses similes sometimes, but those images are not very fantastic in both senses of the word. They're not extremely well written similes. They're not very evocative. He might say something like, this song is like a bestseller, that kind of thing, where you just think, oh, well, I mean, I know what you mean, but it's not really making me think about things on different levels. It's just very pared down and peeled back. Russell's very much the opposite. She'll layer things on top of you. So she'll talk about one image, but layer another image on top. And that's what makes it very rich and also strange.
I want to change gears a little bit here. I came across Dr. Debbie Reese, who is a member of the Nambe Pueblo Native Americans. And she has this blog called American Indians in Children's Literature, where she took 3 days to lay out all of her problems with this book, saying that the Big Tree family playing Indian here was a really big problem. And usually I feel more sensitive to those kinds of things, but this is satire. Do you feel like there's any issue here? They're playing Indian?
I don't think the satire thing really holds up well because, while it is satirical, our sympathies are with the Big Tree family. So I think that we're never really meant to scorn them because of their adoption of this, personal mythology and personal ethnicity. I think another thing that prevents me from really scorning them is that they don't seem as functional. Aside from Kiwi, they don't seem to know how to live in the modern world very well. So for me to criticize them, it's kind of punching down in a way, like I'm very clear. I understand that they don't have any right to co-opt somebody else's ethnicity and somebody else's ancestry, but because they are downtrodden characters and because they're suffering, I feel like that's the least of their worries, or that's the least that I could criticize them for.
The biggest issue I see is, and we've talked about this before with Tommy Orange's There. The American Indian community is struggling with being recognized as still being here. And when you have white families coming in and pretending to be Native Americans, it's almost like saying, well, anyone can be a Native American, because they're almost fictional. You just make up a tribe and you're it. So I think the biggest issue here isn't that they're pretending to be another minority group or claiming different kinds of ancestry. It's that specifically they're claiming the ancestry of people who are struggling with being recognized. It's kind of like you're playing into the stereotype, or you're playing into the problem that Native Americans are fighting against. For me, that is the biggest issue.
You could read this and not see the inherent juxtapositions that Russell is giving us. But I feel that even though I understand what you're saying, and I do recognize that as an issue, I think to only point to that in this book specifically is to ignore the other things that were given, the other clues that we're not supposed to take that seriously. And we get from the very beginning that they recognize they're a white family, even though they are playing up this pretty bad stereotype. But when we go to the mainland with Kiwi, and Kiwi sees his father in the Indian casino, we get this interesting reversal where the Big Tree family, pretending Indian, can't make it in normal society. And we have a group of real Indians operating a successful casino for which Chief Big Tree works. And some of the workers like him, but he's downtrodden there. One of the things that made me think of was Tropic Thunder. I don't know if you guys have seen that movie.
Of course.
But Robert Downey Jr. plays a white man, which he is, who wears blackface as part of this method acting in order to play this black role. There were a number of people who had problems with that, but to have a huge issue with that is to also ignore the actual black character or black characters in that movie that pointed to that, to Robert Downey Jr.'s character, and had a problem with it. So it was very self-aware. It wasn't blackface for blackface's sake.
But did you find this to be self-aware? Because I didn't. I don't think it was self-aware.
Really? I thought it was. We talked about this a little bit before, that Ava has this sort of duality to her where she doesn't believe in the Big Tree mythos. She understands her place in the world to a very adult level in some ways. But at the same time, she does see herself as Ava Big Tree.
The biggest issue is, for me, in Tropic Thunder works because that character is mocked mercilessly for what he's doing. I don't think the Big Trees are really mocked or punished for pretending to be Indians.
They're not mocked or punished, but we see it as unsuccessful, that their duping of people isn't working. And that, at least compared to the casino and the people running it are the ones that are actually successful. And they know how to deal with the modern world, whereas this white family does not.
Are you guys ready for me to put words in other people's mouths? Because I know it's kind of my thing. It's my recurring feature on this podcast. But if I may be so bold, I would say that the people who have a problem with this type of red face or blackface, they have a problem with it that's beyond just being self-aware. I think that they would say being self-aware is not enough. Now, you may disagree, but I think their attitude is that white people and white creators and other non-black or non-native people shouldn't play with these things, even if they think they're getting around it by putting another character in the fiction to criticize them for this behavior. What they want is more than that. They want these things to die. They want these things to no longer be a part of their culture or our culture. And while we still have creators using these tropes, they're not going to die.
Yeah, that is fair. I understand that point of view.
I'm not even sure if I believe it. I understand that playing with these topics like blackface and minstrelsy and things like that is a good way for a provocative writer to get a name for himself if he can do it in a provocative and interesting way. I think that they might also say, well, it's not really your subject. You shouldn't touch it, because if anybody's going to touch it, and maybe they would say nobody should touch it, but if anybody should, it should be a person from the oppressed group. It shouldn't be a white creator.
Even though I don't agree with Dr. Debbie Reese, I also feel like it's not my place to argue too hard against her for that very reason.
Well, don't worry. You can leave speaking for other people to me, because as I mentioned, that's my thing.
Now that we've pissed off Dr. Reese, let's take a break. We'll be back with a discussion on how this book fits into our series of postmodern novels from the South. Welcome back. So we are reading Swamplandia as part of our series Postmodern Novels of the South. I'd like to talk about how this book fits into this series. So when we look at books from the South, I think this is definitely set in the South, in Florida, but it's not just set in the South. It also follows this long tradition, or is a part of this long tradition of Southern Gothic. So for me, that's very interesting, and it definitely fits into novels of the South because of that reason. But what about the other descriptor? What about the other part of this series, the postmodern part? How do you think this novel is postmodern?
For me, the biggest thing is the way that truth is complicated in the story, and the way that progress is also complicated in the story. It's not just a magical story, but it's a story, as Sam has pointed, that shifts from magic to non-magic. I think that's substantial, and I think it's also very substantial that we have this play with the idea of progress and development between the Swamplandia theme park, which seems stuck in like the 1950s, and the World of Darkness, which seems like a modern corporate behemoth.
I'll also add, we've mentioned this multiple times, so the fact that it blurs genres, I think, is something that makes it very postmodern. It doesn't make any firm moral statement, I think also gives it a very postmodern flair.
There's a search for truth and, I suppose, meaning, but as mentioned, you don't fully know what's true most of the time. Even as the magic gets stripped away from the real, there are still questions that you have at the end. For example, Lewis Thanksgiving. That haziness seems to be a hallmark of postmodernism.
Let's focus first on the first descriptor, Southern. It does present a version of Southern Florida that I think some people might find a little bit off-putting. I think if you were actually from the Everglades, you might feel like these characters are caricatures. What do you think?
The chief seems to be a little bit of a caricature, but I don't fully agree because all the characters have this oddness to them, but we see them as fully realized people. Even the chief, we see him for what he actually is at the end. He's this sad, broken down man who has lost first his wife and is losing his way of life. He's losing his home, and he was at risk of losing his whole family. I don't have a problem with the caricature-ness. I think they all get redeemed in a way.
I think that it's not specific to Swamplandia, but I think it's part of the Southern Gothic genre. It represents Southern Florida as this kind of place of backwoods mystery and intrigue. And I think that if there are people out there from Southern Florida who resent that and would like Southern Florida to be seen as, I don't know, modern and cosmopolitan and forward thinking, their beef should not be with Karen Russell, but with all of the Southern Gothic writers, because it's a feature of the entire genre.
Well, here in reality, we know Florida for what it is. We see we see it every day. So I think if they have a beef, they need to turn that lens inward.
Well, sounds like you're focusing their beef in on us.
Come at me, Florida.
For me, it takes on this idea, or it takes on poverty in the South. And that's part of what Southern Gothic is it explores rural poverty and the kind of absurdity that comes from those situations of being very poor and living in the backwoods. So I think because it presents poverty in this way, it's quite sympathetic to these characters, right? It doesn't belittle these characters for being poor they're not stupid. They're just different culturally. I forget which character it was. I think it was Kiwi who says they're an island species. So it doesn't belittle them, as you said, Sam, right? It kind of just presents them as different, and it also presents poverty in a very real way, in a way that makes you feel like this is a problem socially. So it's not really ascribing all these problems to them. It's kind of describing these problems on a societal level.
Well, if we have any listeners from the swamp, definitely please, send me an email. Let me know what's life like in the swamp these days. Is it really like this, or what's up?
Yeah, if you've wrestled any alligators, Ed wants to know. Okay, let's conclude here. Thank you for listening. You can find our reading schedule on Reddit at CanonicalPod, where we also post threads for our book club discussion every Wednesday. We'd love for you to join us there. You can also find us on social media at CanonicalPod. If you would like to support us and your local bookstore, you can use our bookshop.org link, which is included in the episode description. Next week, we will review the last book in our series, The Moviegoer by Walker Percy. Till next time, happy reading. We'll talk to you soon.